Today, is this the calm before the storm in Cuba?
The pressure that the Cuban people and the Cuban government are under right now is unprecedented.
Trump has been turning up the pressure on Cuba with an indictment, a military buildup, and a public threat that he could be the U.S. president to act. So what's next for the island? I'm Tamara Khandaker, and this is The Take.
I'm Lucia Newman. I'm a senior Latin American correspondent and editor for Al Jazeera English, based in Santiago, Chile.
Lucia, welcome back to The Take. It's really, really great to talk to you about Cuba, which we've been wanting to talk about for a while. So towards the end of last week, it felt like maybe we were on the edge of something. On Thursday, U.S. President Donald Trump telling reporters it looks like he will be the first president to intervene in Cuba.
Other presidents have looked at this for 50, 60 years doing something, and it looks like I'll be the one that does it.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying Cuba is a national security threat. There was also the indictment of former President Raul Castro, which we'll get into in a bit. But since then, things have gone a bit quiet. So I'm just wondering how you're reading this. Have things cooled off, or is this maybe the calm before the storm?
I would definitely say the latter, although it's probably not very calm. Usually when you don't hear anything after statements like that, you can imagine that there are a lot of conversations taking place behind the scenes, people going back and forth. So we can only just imagine that the White House is waiting to settle the issue with Iran. So the closer we get or don't get to a settlement of the crisis along the Straits of Hormuz and with Iran, the closer you would get to something happening with Cuba, because it does seem like the White House is sending a message that they've run out of patience, that they want action, that they want concessions, or even a capitulation on the part of the Cuban government. And they certainly aren't getting that so far.
Yeah, right. So we shouldn't read this as de-escalation. It's just Cuba may not be at the top of the pile right now, and this could all come roaring back really soon. And you mentioned the White House is giving signs that they're frustrated that Cuba is not capitulating. And maybe one of those signs is this indictment from last week, which was major news. The U.S. indicted former Cuban President Raul Castro, the brother of Fidel Castro. He's 94 years old, and these charges, they go back to 1996.
Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche making the announcement Wednesday during an event honoring the victims of the 1996 shoot-down of two small planes operated by the exile group Brothers to the Rescue. The indictment accuses Castro, who was Cuba's defense minister at the time, of ordering that attack.
So this happened 30 years ago, and I guess the first question that comes to mind is why do this now? And it's also maybe worth mentioning that the timing of this indictment was kind of symbolic. It was announced May 20th, which is Cuba's original Independence Day. And maybe talk about that a bit.
The date that was chosen to announce the indictment of Raul Castro was very symbolic and also very interesting, because it marks the date that Cuba became a republic, an independent republic. At the same time, when that happened, the United States was still in charge, or became in charge of the country. Spain was out, the United States was in. That is what could happen again. But the timing is meant to send a very, very clear message, not just to the Cuban authorities, but also to the Cuban Americans, to the Cuban bloc inside the U.S. Congress. Remember that unlike Iranians or Venezuelans or others who live in the United States that have an issue with the country they came from, they don't have a bloc in Congress. That's not the case with Cuban Americans. They have a voice, and a strong voice, in Congress. And they have been pushing and pushing for years, the various administrations, Democrats and Republicans, to take a harder stance against the Cuban government. And this is meant to appease them several months before midterm elections, which are crucial for the Trump administration.
Right. So this would be a hit for the Cuban Americans. And in Miami.
The Cuban Americans in Miami and others, but and then also on the other hand, they are unhappy with the speed of progress or the lack of progress with their talks with the Cuban government. There've been very few of them, but they have taken place. Both sides have recognized that, and so to indict the last living Castro brother who brought about the Cuban Revolution, a historic revolutionary comandante, as he is known, even though he's retired, but he still has influence. To touch him would be almost like grabbing Fidel Castro at this late stage. And it sends, again, a very, very strong message, or trying to say we mean business. And it was quite shocking to many Cubans in Cuba when they heard this.
Well, I was actually wondering about that. You said that it would be like grabbing Fidel Castro, and that kind of brings me to my next question, which is that a lot of people are seeing echoes of Venezuela here. Obviously, Trump used old criminal charges against Nicolas Maduro as part of the justification to capture him, bring him to the U.S. to face narco-terrorism charges. And this is different. It's not about drugs, but it does feel like the same sort of playbook. The thing is,
Yes.
Castro is not a sitting president. He hasn't been since 2018. So what would actually be the impact of arresting him?
Well, first of all, they would have to go in and get him. Even though we have heard from the U.S. Justice Department that they expect him to turn himself in, but I think that that's just talk. It's not going to happen. They would have to go in and get him. That would mean an act of military aggression of some sort into the island. That has not happened ever in all this time, ever since the Cuban Revolution. Cuba is a country that has very, very disciplined armed forces. It has an army, and these soldiers have fought in other countries, particularly in Africa. And they were also, they showed just how brave they are and how much they're willing to fight when the incursion took place in Venezuela to take out Nicolas Maduro, because there were 33 people were killed and they were Cubans. His bodyguards, if you like, his defense team were Cuban soldiers, and they died down to the last man. It could be much, much, much more difficult to carry out an extraction of somebody like Raul Castro than it was with Nicolas Maduro. The other point is that it wouldn't change the structure of the Cuban Communist Party that's in power.
Yeah.
But it would send, again, a very strong message. If we can take Raul Castro, what else can we do? That would be next. Like, it's time to capitulate, or it's time to give in to whatever is the bottom line for the White House. And that is what we don't know yet.
The person who's driving this in Washington is Marco Rubio, and for him, this is personal, right? He comes from the world of anti-Castro exile politics in Florida, and he sees like the possibility of toppling the communist government as part of his own story. Could you talk about that a little bit and the role that he's playing in all of this?
Absolutely, there is no question that the person who's driving this and is putting it at the top of the agenda instead of at the bottom of the agenda is Marco Rubio. He comes from Cuban parents who went to the United States before the Cuban Revolution. They had to make their way up the ladder like so many migrants do. But he was brought up in Miami. Miami is the epicenter of the Cuban exile community, where they breathe and think and drink coffee, thinking and dreaming of the day that the Cuban Communist government will fall. And he got into politics very much promising that he was going to help overthrow or bring about the end of the Cuban dictatorship, he calls it, the Cuban tyranny. And that is what helped him get elected. He's a hardliner on Cuba. Mm-hmm. And as are almost, not all, but most of the Cuban American politicians from Florida. Now he has made it all the way, or almost all the way, to the top. He is the U.S. Secretary of State. And he has, I can't imagine that he didn't whisper in President Donald Trump's ear before he accepted that position, that I'll do whatever you want, but in exchange, I want Castro's head, or I want the Cuban government's head. Mm-hmm. I can just imagine that scenario or scene. While President Trump says, sometimes he goes back and forth. It's unclear whether he wants economic reforms right away before political reforms, or does it all have to come at the same time? But the pressure that Cuban people and the Cuban government are under right now is unprecedented. And I think we have to now talk about not just Marco Rubio and his influence, but about what's been happening over the last 4 months, talking about the fuel embargo.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Trump has been pressuring Cuba on many different fronts. He's slapped new sanctions on Cuban officials and entities. He's gone after Cuba's fuel supply. He's threatened tariffs on countries that sell oil to the island. And Cuba now says it's run out of diesel and fuel oil.
Pumps have gone dry in Havana as Cuba completely runs out of diesel and fuel oil amid a U.S. blockade. That's according to the country's Energy and Mines Minister, Vicente de la Olevi, who said on state television that the national grid was in a critical state.
So how is this being felt on the island? What does it actually mean for people's daily lives?
It's crippled the country. No country in the modern world can function without fuel. Cuba doesn't have or has very, very little fuel of its own. It's begun in the last year and a half to try to produce solar energy, but you can imagine how much that's a very small percentage. It means that there's practically no public transportation. People cannot get to work. They can't get to the hospital if they're sick. The nurses, the doctors can't get to the hospitals. When you get to the hospitals, there's no fuel in their power plants anymore. So you have to operate somebody in the dark, almost blind. Children can't be operated. People who have to have dialysis can't get dialysis because the nurses and doctors have to pump the blood manually back into their bodies as they try to clean them. So people's lives are, of course, in danger. There's the distribution of food, which was always, people were barely getting by, and their access to food has now collapsed. You can't get to the vegetables and the few things that are produced in the country to the markets because there's no transportation. They can't cut the sugar cane because there's no fuel for their tractors. You can just imagine a world where you're put on a planet where there's no fuel, and that's more or less what they have. They have just enough, though, curiously enough, to be able to charge their cell phones. Okay. So people do have, unlike in the caveman days, they still have access now to internet, which is very interesting because that wasn't the case when I lived in Cuba. And that it means that people know what's going on. They're keeping track of the information. They're not in a bubble. It's been 4 months since they've received fuel, except for one Russian tanker, and there are no signs that Russia will send another one. And one more thing I want to add, it also means water. It may be an island surrounded by water, but drinking water has become a huge issue because you need pumps to bring the water up in order to turn on the faucet. And the water pumps aren't working because they are powered by electricity.
Wow. I mean, these sound like wartime conditions. Yeah. And Cubans have been through a lot over the course of their history, but it's probably fair to say that they've never been through something this bad before, right? I mean, this is as close to just total collapse as you can get.
I think it's very fair to say that. It's not an exaggeration. And I know because I went to Cuba, I witnessed what they called the special period with collapse of the Soviet bloc. Back in the beginning of 1990, those first few years, it was called the special period by Fidel Castro, and people had no transportation. China sent them bicycles, and people who were like 70 years old had to learn to ride a bicycle for the first time. And it was very difficult. Some people went blind temporarily or permanently because of lack of vitamins. They didn't have enough food, but it wasn't this bad. At least people will tell you it didn't seem that bad. And also at the time Fidel Castro was in power, there was at least more mystique still. There were people who still trusted and supported the Cuban Revolution, and they managed to survive. And then came Chavez. Hugo Chavez from Venezuela came and rescued the country. They had also made some reforms to allow tourism to come into the country. So they got out of that. Yeah. And then things just went back to being bad.
Yeah.
But this, as I say, is not bad. This is horrific.
And it's happening in large part because of this maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration is putting on the island, which they say is for the good of the island.
Yes, I just let me just mention
Yeah.
something there. It's quite extraordinary that when asked about this, Secretary of State Marco Rubio answers, it's because of their economy, because of their horrible economy. But then why are you putting a fuel blockade around the country? If the country is already in a bad shape, how can you say you're not punishing the people
Yeah.
in their totality to get rid of the government if you don't let them have the most basic things they need for their sustenance and their life?
Right. And I want to come back to sort of how this is impacting people and who they're blaming and who they're feeling angry towards. But I also just wanted to ask you about what else have we heard from Cuban officials and how are they preparing for a possible military intervention?
The head of the CIA was just in Cuba, and the conversation, at least on the part of from the Cuban government point of view, was to try to convince him that they did not represent any kind of threat whatsoever. He returned to Washington and said exactly the contrary. What is Cuba doing? They have been preparing for a military intervention from the United States for decades and decades. There are militias, people are trained. How well or not, I can't say. Their ammunition is not the most modern, but there is certainly an army that's well trained and willing to fight. And they've fought in many other countries. But if there is to be some kind of a military attack, people now are being told, as they were many years ago, and I remember this myself, that they will be told by the CDR, Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. It's very well organized. And it's used to organize people when there's going to be a hurricane or if there's going to be an invasion. So you get every block of people, they go to a certain place, then they're told where they have to go. They're told they have to have food ready, medicine, and they will go to this place where the Cuban army will protect them. Cuba, there are places in Havana that I know of, Alamar, which is by the coast of Havana, which has tunnels. They were built during the Cold War period. There are also trenches and tunnels on the other side of closer to the downtown area of Havana. So there are places. How clean they are, how prepared they are, to how many people they could actually take in, I can't tell you. They're not that large, but there are areas with tunnels and places where they could send certain people, children, women, maybe old people, to be safe in case there was to be a military incursion.
Wow. So when you talk to people on the island, do they see what the U.S. is doing as helpful, or do they see it as collective punishment? And do you hear from people that they want the U.S. to invade, or do you think they still emotionally identify with the revolution? Would they stand with the Cuban government? What's your sense when you talk to people right now?
There's some of all of those things. There are people that would like to see the Marines marching in tomorrow and get rid of the government and start, go back to the past that they may or may not even have known, depending on how old they are. Because the revolution was 67 years ago. So you can imagine there are many, many generations that have never lived under any other type of government. But there are others that say that they want change in the government, but they want the Cuban people to bring about that change. They don't want to be a U.S. colony. Cuba by the way, was the last colony of Spain in the Americas. So it's kind of like a thorn in the side of many people. It's a matter of pride. They are very proud people, and they want to be able to rule their own country their own way. People said to me, if we haven't been allowed to have our own say all these years under this government, the Cuban government, which is a one-party state, why should we now allow another country to come and just replace them? I do hear a lot of that. And then there are other people who just say, we want economic change. We don't want anything that's violent. Violence means people will be killed, and nobody wants to see that.
Well, you touched on this earlier, but there are a lot of similarities here. However, Cuba is not Venezuela,
No.
right? There's no oil industry. There is no obvious person or faction waiting to take over. If the U.S. did manage to topple the communist government, what do you think they would want to happen afterwards? How would they, rebuild this country?
I don't know what they would do. And politically, I mean, they would presume, I mean, there isn't a political party there, an opposition party. They'd have to start from scratch. And probably that would mean that they would be their tutors. There would be a tutelage. The United States would sort of say, well, we'll run the country for a while until you guys are ready. How long will that be? Who knows? But from an economic point of view, which is, I think, what they're really, really interested in, is to open up the country to U.S. investment, to foreign investment, and let Cubans trade, import, export. They don't have much to export right now, but they certainly have beautiful beaches, and it could sort of replicate what we see in the Dominican Republic, which lives primarily from tourism, and many other islands of the Caribbean, for that matter. They would have to deal with the lawsuits that have been waiting to be processed for decades and decades from Cuban Americans who want to get back or get compensation for what the Cuban government expropriated after the revolution. So there would be those sorts of things that could happen. But I think it's economic, but it's also political. And the political one is the big, big question mark if this were to happen.
Well, I guess just to wrap up, Lucia, you've covered Cuba for decades. I wonder how different this moment feels to you. You talked about how proud Cubans are, how much they've resisted. This is a country with a deep revolutionary history, a long history of surviving U.S. pressure. Can you see a way for the system to persevere and survive this moment too?
I don't know. It's there was a time when the whole country, or a great deal of the country, was behind the revolution. This support has been waning decade after decade. People have lost faith. There are some who still feel that there is, however, a lot that can be rescued from the original idea of a socialist state where there was social equality. That was what it was supposed to be. Above all else, they would like to preserve their education system, their health system, and other guarantees that their government can provide. But it would have to change radically. And the question is, how much time does it have to do that with all this, with the Trump administration in office?
Well, Lucia, thank you so much for your insight, your expertise, and for giving us a window into what's happening on the island. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.